This is the story of a true animal horror story I'm going to tell you. And you need to listen carefully because once you hear it, you might never look at your pet the same way again. It happened to a guy named Daniel, a quiet, kind man who loved animals, especially his dog, Max. But sometimes love for animals can blind you to what they really are, or what they can become. Daniel lived in a small countryside village in England. He worked as a graphic designer from home, lived alone, and didn't care much for city life. All he needed was peace, coffee, and Max, his big black German shepherd. Max had been with him for 3 years, loyal, smart, and strong, the kind of dog that made you feel safe. Daniel used to joke that Max would fight a bear for him if he had to. But something changed last winter. It started small. Max began acting strange, barking at nothing, refusing to go into certain rooms of the house, and growling at the basement door. Now here's the thing. Daniel never used the basement. It was an old stone-walled cellar that came with the house. Cold, damp, and filled with spider webs. He only kept cleaning stuff down there. But one night, around 3 a.m., Max stood in front of the basement door and just stared. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He just stood there, stiff like a statue, tail low, ears down. Daniel called out to him, but Max didn't move. Only when Daniel walked over and gently touched him did Max finally look away and follow him back to bed. But the weirdness didn't stop. Max refused to eat for 2 days after that. Then, one morning, Daniel found Max sitting outside the bathroom. Again, just staring, like he was guarding something. Daniel began feeling uneasy in the house, like someone, or something, was watching him. At first he blamed stress, maybe even too much coffee. But then came the smell. It was this foul, rotten meat smell that filled the house out of nowhere. No dead animals, no spoiled food. He cleaned everything top to bottom, but it still came back, always strongest near the basement door. Then, one night, Daniel heard Max whining, not barking, not growling, whining, like he was scared. Daniel rushed downstairs and found Max sitting at the foot of the stairs, tail tucked in, shaking, and the basement door was open. Daniel swore he had locked it. The key always stayed in a drawer. He walked slowly down the basement steps, flashlight in hand, Max refusing to follow. The light flickered as he reached the bottom. Nothing seemed out of place. No intruders, no animals, just silence and cold stone walls. But then, his flashlight caught something on the floor. It was a pile of deep scratches, long, sharp claw marks in the stone itself. That made no sense. No dog could do that. Not even a bear could scratch stone like that. And the mark, they formed a strange shape, almost like a symbol. Not any language Daniel knew, just a circle with weird lines around it, like a sun with crooked rays. He backed out of the basement quickly, shut the door, and nailed it shut. Literally. Hammered in 5 big nails and locked the door with a chain. He even pushed a heavy cabinet in front of it. After that night, Max wouldn't even go near that side of the house. But things only got worse. Daniel started seeing shadows. Not full shapes, just movements in the corners of his eyes. He heard whispers when he walked past mirrors. At night, Max would pace the house, growling at the windows even when the curtains were drawn. Then one night, Daniel woke up to the sound of scratching coming from under his bed. He jumped out, heart racing, and yanked the flashlight from his nightstand. Max stood outside the bedroom door, growling, not moving. Daniel shined the light under the bed and saw nothing. But the sound kept going. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He finally pulled the whole bed away from the wall, and the scratching stopped. In the dust under the bed, there were claw marks again. In the wood floor, same as the basement, and drawn in the middle was that same sun-like symbol. The eye. Next day, Daniel took Max and left. He drove 2 towns over to stay with his sister Emily. She didn't believe his full story, just thought the house was old and maybe had rats or something. But Daniel knew. He could feel it. Whatever was in that house, it wasn't just an animal, it wasn't normal, and it wasn't gone. 2 days later, while staying with Emily, Max started acting up again. He barked wildly at the guest room closet. When Daniel opened it, nothing, just coats and a vacuum cleaner. That night, Max disappeared. Daniel panicked. He searched for hours in the freezing rain, calling his name. He finally found Max at a nearby hilltop, sitting in the mud, covered in scratches, and looking up at the sky, just sitting there, breathing heavily. Daniel carried him home shaking. Then came the dream. Daniel said it was the most real dream he'd ever had. He was standing in his old basement, but it was deeper, way deeper than before. The walls were covered in claw marks and symbols, and in the middle there was Max. But he wasn't barking or wagging his tail. He was staring at something behind Daniel. When Daniel turned around, he saw a creature, black, long-limbed, with empty eyes and a mouth that opened way too wide. Its body was made of shadows and fur, and its claws, they were the same as the ones in the stone. It leaned in close, almost touching Daniel's face, and whispered one thing: "Return what's mine." Daniel woke up screaming. The next day, Max disappeared again, but this time, Daniel never found him. He searched for weeks, put up posters, contacted shelters. Nothing. Months passed. Daniel never went back to the house. He sold it, moved to the city. He's okay now, mostly, but he doesn't own pets anymore. And sometimes when the nights are too quiet, he still hears that scratching. He told me once, Max was never just a dog. I think he was keeping something away, something old, something that wanted me. And now that he's gone, I don't know what's keeping it back. And you know what's the part that gives me chills? Last week, Daniel called me. His voice was shaking. He said he woke up to find claw marks on the inside of his bedroom window, and in the dust on the floor was that same sun symbol. So if your pet ever starts acting strange, staring at doors, growling at walls, don't ignore it. Maybe they see something you don't, and maybe, just maybe, they're the only thing standing between you and what's waiting in the dark. This is the story of a true animal horror story I'm about to tell you. It's about a man named Jack. Now, Jack wasn't your usual guy. He wasn't afraid of anything. He worked as a private investigator in a small town called Everwood, a place where nothing ever really happened. Or so he thought. One chilly autumn evening, Jack got a call. The kind of call that seemed simple at first, but turned into something far worse. A woman named Margaret, who lived on the edge of the town, had reported strange behavior from her dog, a huge muscular Rottweiler named Thor. At first, it sounded like an ordinary case. Dogs acting out, maybe a bit of aggression or territorial behavior. Jack didn't think much of it, but when he saw the fear in Margaret's eyes, he knew this was different. Margaret lived in a big old house at the edge of Everwood, surrounded by thick woods. The kind of house that looked like it had been abandoned decades ago, though she had lived there for years. She was a quiet woman, kept to herself mostly. Jack had seen her around the town a few times, always walking Thor. She'd loved that dog like a son, Jack knew she wasn't the kind of person to exaggerate, so when she said something was wrong with Thor, he decided to take the case. When Jack arrived at her home, the first thing that struck him was the silence. It wasn't the usual silence you expect in the woods. It was eerie, heavy. It felt like something was watching him, waiting. As he walked up the creaky steps of her porch, Thor barked from inside. Not a regular bark, though. This one was different. It was low and menacing, almost as if the dog didn't recognize who was standing outside. Margaret greeted him at the door with a shaky smile. She led him inside, where Thor was pacing back and forth in the living room. He was huge, almost as big as a bear, with dark eyes that seemed to glimmer in the dim light. Jack could tell something was wrong the moment he looked into Thor's eyes. The dog wasn't looking at him like a pet would. No, it was more like it was sizing him up, watching him closely like it could sense his every move. Thor's been acting up for the last week, Margaret explained, wringing her hands nervously. At first, it was just barking at the windows. Then he started growling at the walls. He won't go outside anymore, and every night he howls, like something's out there. Jack nodded, trying to stay calm. He didn't want to show fear. He was used to dealing with difficult situations. He approached Thor cautiously, his hand outstretched. The dog stopped pacing and stared at him for a long moment, then, unexpectedly, sniffed his hand. The look in Thor's eyes changed for a second. It was as if the dog knew something Jack didn't. "Let me take a look around," Jack said, trying to keep his voice steady. He walked through the house, but nothing seemed out of place. Old furniture, worn carpets, a few framed family pictures on the walls. Nothing that screamed danger, but the atmosphere in the house was thick, like the air had been holding its breath for too long. As Jack walked toward the back door, he heard it, scratching. Soft at first, then louder. It was coming from the basement. Margaret, who had followed him into the kitchen, looked pale. "That's the other thing," she whispered. "It's been coming from the basement. I thought maybe it was rats, but it doesn't sound like rats. It sounds different." Jack didn't want to go down there. He'd been in plenty of creepy situations before, but something about this place felt off. Still, his job was to find answers, so he grabbed the flashlight from his bag and motioned for Margaret to stay upstairs. The basement door was old, with peeling paint and rusting hinges. As Jack opened it, the cold air from below hit him. The smell down there was worse than anything he'd expected. Musty, like old wood and mildew. As he descended the steps, the scratching grew louder, now mixed with low growls. But this time, it wasn't just Thor's growling. It was something else, something deeper. At the bottom of the stairs, Jack's flashlight caught something strange. The floor was covered in dirt, but there were strange, deep claw marks on the walls, like something had been scratching at them for hours, maybe days. And the smell? It was worse down there. It was a rot, something decayed, mixed with a sickening metallic scent. Jack stepped forward, following the sound. Then he saw it. In the far corner of the basement was a large, dark shape. A shadow, bigger than a dog, crouching low. Jack's flashlight flickered as it shone on the figure. It was Thor. But not the Thor he'd seen upstairs. This version of Thor was different. Its eyes were glowing a sickly yellow, and its body was unnaturally large. Its muscles seemed to stretch and bulge in unnatural ways. And its teeth, they were longer, sharper, almost like fangs. Jack froze. This wasn't just an angry dog. This was something else. Something far worse. And that's when it happened. The creature lunged at Jack, faster than he could react. It snapped its jaws just inches from his face, its growl vibrating in his chest. Jack scrambled backward, but before he could make it to the stairs, something strange happened. The creature stopped. It was like it was frozen in place, staring at something behind him. Jack turned slowly, his heart racing. And that's when he saw it. A figure standing in the doorway of the basement, just outside the light of his flashlight. It was tall, thin, and wore dark clothes. It had a face, but it was pale, almost like it had been carved out of marble. Its eyes, those eyes, were black, completely black. No whites at all. It was watching Jack. No, it was watching the creature. And then, with one swift motion, the creature, Thor, cowered. It lowered its head and backed into the corner. The figure raised one hand, and Thor, once a terrifying beast, now looked like a scared pup. "I'm sorry, Jack," the figure whispered, its voice cold and sharp. "But this is what happens when animals become more than they're meant to be." Jack could hardly breathe. He didn't understand, but he did know one thing. Whatever was in that basement wasn't natural. It wasn't just a dog. It was a curse. Something that had turned Thor into a monster. The figure stepped forward, its hand still raised. "You're not meant to see this," it said. With a final flickering motion, the light in the basement went out. When Jack woke up, he was in his car, parked at the edge of Everwood, with no memory of how he'd gotten there. The house? Gone. Completely. There was no sign of Margaret, no sign of Thor, no sign of the figure. Just an empty lot where the house used to stand. Jack left Everwood that same day and never came back. He never spoke about it to anyone. But he told me once, years later, that sometimes, when he walks through the woods at night, he can still hear the scratching. And once, just once, he swears he saw a pair of glowing yellow eyes watching him from the shadows. So if you ever visit Everwood, or if you hear scratching at your door in the middle of the night, remember this: not all animals are what they seem. Some of them are far darker than you can ever imagine, and some of them may still be out there. This is the story of a man named Henry, and I swear to you, you'll want to listen closely. What happened to him that summer changed his life forever, and it's not something you'll forget easily once you hear it. Henry was a writer, someone who loved solitude. He lived in a small cottage in the countryside, far from the noise and chaos of the city. It was the perfect place for him, peaceful, quiet, and ideal for focusing on his work. But as peaceful as it was, Henry never could shake the feeling that something was a little off. It was the kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and immediately know something isn't right, but you can't put your finger on it. He'd moved into the cottage just a few months earlier, after a difficult breakup. The isolation was meant to help him clear his head and finish his novel. At first, everything seemed perfect, but as time went on, he started to notice odd things happening. Strange noises at night, creaks and groans coming from the floorboards as if someone or something was moving around when he wasn't looking. Then, one night, something happened that would stay with Henry forever. It was late in the evening, and Henry was sitting in his study, working on his manuscript. He hadn't heard anything strange in days, and he thought maybe the house was finally settling in. But just as he leaned back in his chair to stretch, he heard it. A scratching sound. Not the kind of scratching a mouse might make in the walls, but something heavier, more deliberate. At first he thought it was just the wind, or maybe a branch, scraping against the window. But when he listened more closely, it sounded like it was coming from the floor, just beneath him. Slowly, he stood up and walked over to the window, peering outside. But nothing was there. No animals, no wind, just the dark, quiet night. He shook it off. It was probably just his imagination. But as soon as he sat back down, the scratching came again. Louder this time. A slow, deliberate scratching that seemed to get closer. Henry's heart started to race. He stood up and walked over to the door, his hand gripping the handle. There was no way he was going to sit in that room while whatever it was moved around in the house. But as soon as he opened the door, he froze. There, at the end of the hallway, was a figure, a person, standing completely still, facing the wall. It was the woman. Henry had never seen her before. She wasn't anyone from the village, and she certainly wasn't anyone who lived near him. Her long, dark hair cascaded down her back, but it was her eyes that caught him. Her eyes were black, completely black, like there was no white to them at all. Just dark, hollow pits staring back at him. He couldn't move. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but his voice was trapped in his throat. The woman didn't move. She didn't speak. She just stood there facing the wall. Then, as if on cue, the scratching began again. Louder this time, almost deafening. It seemed to come from beneath the floor, beneath the house itself, as if something was clawing its way out of the earth. Henry backed up, his mind racing. The woman remained still. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the scratching stopped. The woman turned her head slowly toward Henry, and he could see the blackness in her eyes was even deeper now. "I've been waiting," she whispered, her voice cold and distant, like it wasn't even hers. Henry felt a chill run through him, like something had just crawled up his spine. He wanted to run, to escape, but his legs felt like stone. The woman's mouth opened slightly, and for a moment, Henry thought he saw something moving inside. It wasn't just a voice he heard. It was something far worse. "You shouldn't have. Come here," she said, her voice now coming from all around him, as if the house itself was speaking. That's when the scratching returned. It was no longer coming from beneath the floor. It was coming from every direction. The walls, the ceiling, the floors. It was as if something was tearing its way through the entire house. The woman began to move toward him, her steps unnaturally, slow, like she was gliding across the floor. Henry finally found his voice and screamed, but it wasn't enough to stop her. She reached out for him with long, bony fingers, her black eyes never leaving his. The moment she touched his arm, he felt a jolt of cold electricity shoot through him, and he screamed in pain. It felt like his skin was being torn from his bones. The house seemed to shake, the floor buckling beneath him. Henry couldn't see anything except the black eyes of the woman. And then with a final scream, he felt himself fall into darkness. The next morning, Henry woke up in his bed drenched in sweat, his heart racing. It had all been a dream, right? It had to be. But when he looked around, he noticed something strange. The scratches on the walls, the ceiling, and the floor, they were real. They weren't just in his dream. They were physical, as if something had really been clawing at the house. Henry tried to leave, but when he opened the door, he saw that the world outside had changed. The lush countryside that once surrounded his cottage was now dead and dry. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches stretching like claws toward the sky. The air was thick, suffocating. That's when he realized the truth. The woman hadn't just been a dream. She had been waiting for him, and now there was no escape. The house wasn't just a house anymore. It was a prison. A prison for whatever was inside it, and it wasn't going to let him leave. Days passed. Weeks. Time seemed to lose its meaning. Henry tried to leave, but every time he stepped outside, he found himself back in the same place, standing in front of the cottage, as if the house itself had trapped him there. The woman never came back, but Henry could still hear the scratching. It never stopped. It came from beneath the floorboards, from the walls, from the ground itself. Whatever was in the house, whatever had been clawing its way to the surface, was still there. And now, so was he. They say that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the scratching echoing through the countryside. If you ever find yourself near that old cottage, don't go inside, because there are things waiting in the dark, things with eyes darker than the night, and once they find you, there's no escaping. This is the story of a true animal horror story I'm going to tell you. And listen to me carefully, because once I start, you might start hearing strange sounds at night too. It's not one of those stories you read in books or see in movies. No, this one actually happened. And it happened to my friend Ravi, someone I knew very well. He wasn't the kind to make up stuff. In fact, he was the most serious and down-to-earth guy you'd ever meet. But after what happened to him, he changed. Completely. Ravi had recently gotten a job as a forest guard in a remote wildlife reserve. It was way out in the middle of nowhere. Trees everywhere, thick fog in the mornings, and the sounds of animals echoing through the night. There were no big cities or even small towns nearby, just the forest. He was excited at first. He loved animals and nature. He used to say it was peaceful, that it felt like living in a different world altogether. His cabin was a wooden one-room shelter at the edge of the reserve. It had a radio for emergencies, a bed, a table, and some basic supplies. Nothing fancy. He lived alone, but every now and then another guard would come check on him or bring supplies. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. He'd report animal activity, keep track of movement, and walk patrol routes deep in the jungle. But then something started to feel off. He told me about it in person, much later, when he had finally left the job. He looked pale when he spoke, like his mind was still stuck back there. He said it started with the animals acting strange. You see, animals have patterns. Times they come out, times they sleep. But the night patrols suddenly got quiet. Too quiet. No howling, no movement, nothing. Even the birds were silent. And that silence, it wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, like something was watching. One night, while doing his routine patrol, he saw a shadow moving through the trees. It was large, bigger than a deer, but it moved too fast, too low to the ground. He thought maybe it was a bear, but bears weren't common in that area. He pointed his flashlight into the trees, but whatever it was, it vanished like smoke. Then, the scratches began. Not on him, but on the walls of his cabin. It started with light marks, like twigs brushing against the wood. But the next night, they got deeper. Sharp, claw-like. Long, dragging lines across the door and windows. He tried brushing it off, thinking maybe a wildcat was roaming nearby. But then he started hearing the growls. Not loud, but deep and slow. Right outside his window, just as he was about to fall asleep. He grabbed his flashlight and rushed outside more than once. But there was nothing, not even footprints. A few nights later, he saw it. He was returning from a late patrol and the moon was full. He said he felt like he was being followed. Every step he took, he heard one behind him. He stopped. So did the sound. He turned fast and saw it, just for a second, standing in the middle of the path. It looked like a wolf, but too tall, too lean, with eyes that didn't shine like normal animal eyes. They were black, and they didn't blink. He raised his rifle, but the creature didn't move. Instead, it let out a growl that sounded almost human. Then it vanished into the trees, just like that. No sound, no leaves rustling. Gone. Ravi stopped going out at night after that. He stayed locked inside, flashlight in hand, gun loaded. But it didn't help. That thing, whatever it was, started coming closer. One night it scratched the door so hard it nearly broke through. The wooden planks were torn and bent in the morning. Another night, he heard it breathing through the tiny gap in his window. Just breathing, slow and steady. He covered the window with a blanket, but the breathing continued till sunrise. One evening, a fellow guard named Pintu came to visit. Ravi told him everything, hoping he'd help or at least stay the night. But Pintu just laughed it off. "Maybe you've been alone too long," he said. "It's probably just a tiger messing with you." Ravi begged him not to leave, but Pintu left anyway. He was never seen again. A search team went out 2 days later when Pintu didn't report back. They found his motorbike abandoned near the patrol trail. No signs of struggle, no blood. But his helmet was found half buried in mud, with claw marks on it. That was when Ravi knew he had to get out. He sent a message on the emergency radio, but no one responded. The static was constant, like the signal was being blocked. The next few nights he didn't sleep. He sat in the corner of his cabin with his gun pointed at the door. The creature, he called it the beast by then, came every night. Sometimes it walked around the cabin for hours. Sometimes it sat on the roof. Yes, the roof. He heard its claws tapping, dragging along the wooden panels. Then came the worst night. Ravi had fallen asleep for just a few minutes, he said. When he woke up, the door was open. Just open. He didn't remember unlocking it. He grabbed his gun and walked slowly to the door, flashlight shaking in his hand. The forest outside was pitch black, silent as death. He took one step out and saw something on the ground. It was a row of dead birds, their necks twisted, their eyes missing, laid out in a straight line from the door to the edge of the woods, like a message, like a warning. He didn't sleep after that. He stayed up for 2 more nights. Then finally someone from the reserve came to bring supplies. When they saw him, they were shocked. He had lost weight, his eyes were sunken, and he was covered in scratches. Not deep ones, but small, like someone, or something, had been clawing at him lightly. Every night, he quit that same day. The cabin was sealed, and a new one was built deeper inside the reserve. But the forest guards still talk about the area where Ravi stayed. They say the animals still avoid that patch. Birds don't fly over it. Tigers don't roam near it. And at night, if you pass by it, you might hear the growling. Soft, close, just beyond the trees. Ravi moved to the city after that. He still won't go near forests. He won't even keep pets. He says sometimes, in his dreams, he still hears that slow breathing at his window, still sees those black eyes in the dark. And you know what the scariest part is? When I met him last, he showed me his back. There were new claw marks, fresh ones. He hadn't gone back to the forest. Whatever it was, it followed him. So next time you hear your dog barking at nothing, or your cat staring into a corner with wide eyes, just remember this story. Because sometimes animals see things we don't. And some animals, well, some aren't animals at all.